talking about the myth that people only use 10% of their brain. Various studies have found that a large percentage of the population believes that there is either empty space or untapped potential hiding within the other 90% of the brain, even including people who work with brains like neuroscientists. So, what makes this myth so popular? Well, to start, people are always looking for easy answers and they have insecurities that they want to be solved by these easy answers or easy cures for something. People might be afraid or unsure of their ability to succeed, and so if they can latch on to this myth and say, well, I can only use 10% of my brain, if I could just untap into this other 90%, I could be extremely successful. However, this kind of thought process also makes them easy prey for marketing, whether this be through self-help books or self-help advisors, or even just something as simple as YouTube videos that get money off of engagement. People are always trying to sell something. And so this myth is an easy thing to sell to people. You could easily say, I have this health supplement, I have this advice, I have this program, I have this video that's talking about how this is true. And you could sell it to these people who actually do believe it. Another thing people do, such as an unknown airline ad from a while ago, is you can say, oh, well, if you choose our product, we can tell you're using more than the average person. We can tell you're using 50-60% of your brain instead of the average 10. Lastly, something such as media portrayals or like films can push this ideology more and further by making films about the myth. For example, the movie Limitless has the premise that by tapping into this other 90%, you are magically able to have superpowers or super abilities, or, you're ahead of the rest of the population, essentially. So, while movies like this are obviously fiction, they continue to push a narrative, they continue to push misinformation, and they continue to push this search for getting better by easy answers. So, how do we know that this is a myth? Well, to start, we know that natural selection requires it to be a myth. Most people know about Darwin's theory of evolution and natural selection. They know that the smaller finches were unable to eat larger seeds and therefore died off, allowing bigger birds to thrive where previously they wouldn't be able to. This is because being a bigger bird with a bigger beak requires more energy to sustain. So, sustaining this body mass is expensive, and they have to have a good reason to do so. For the birds, the idea is that they can eat the bigger seeds and therefore thrive, whereas the small birds are unable to. So, it is justified to spend that much energy. For us, our brains are large and require a lot of oxygen to maintain them. So pushing oxygen into our brains is expensive. So we have to have a reason to use 100% of our brain, or else we would either lose it or it would be used for something else. Also, things such as brain injuries prove that this can't be true. If you injure even a small portion of your brain, you can have devastating results. So if we only use 10% of it, we would assume that we could see 80% damage and you can still thrive. Obviously, this is not the case. Lastly, things such as new technology, including electrostimulation, prove this to be false. We have a lot of research and a lot of funding going into researching what each part of the brain does and how vital it is to us. We know that each part has its own function and that you are not going to see just empty space inside of a brain and what it's doing. Electrostimulation also really helps to prove this because we can stimulate different parts of the brain and see different results as it responds. If we just had empty space there, that wouldn't happen. So, what misunderstandings led to this myth? To start, there was this phrase essentially that 10% of intellectual potential is never realized. That eventually became 10% of brain power, 10% of the brain. So we've taken this and we've shifted it to say that 10% of the brain is not used. Other things are the misunderstanding of the phrase silent cortex, which is now a part of the brain we've renamed to the association cortex. It could also be due to people misunderstanding or running with the idea that a lot of researchers back then didn't know more than 10% of the brain. They didn't know what it did or how it functioned. Lastly, a reason this could be the case is because of glial cells. So these cells that we didn't know what they did for a long time outnumber neurons. And so people might take it to think, well, glial cells don't do anything and they make up such a large percentage of the brain, so therefore a large percentage of the brain does nothing.
I want to explain what psychologists and researchers think about the humans only using 10% of their brain myth. Many people have heard the claim that humans only use 10% of their brain, but psychologists and neuroscientists pretty much agree that this idea is a myth. Barry Gordon, who is a neurologist at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine in Baltimore, says, though it's an alluring idea, the 10% myth is so wrong that it is almost laughable. Neuroscientists can use modern brain imaging techniques such as fMRIs and PET scans that show that nearly all areas of the brain are active during different tasks, and all regions serve important functions. He also said that the idea that we only use 10% of our brain is absurd. The brain is active at almost all times. Barry Gordon also said that there's no definitive culprit to pin on the blame for starting this legend, but the notion has been linked to the American psychologist and author William James, who argued in The Energies of Men that we are making use of only a small part of our possible mental and physical resources. It's also been associated with Albert Einstein, who supposedly used it to explain his cosmic towering intellect. But in general, we have modern technology that can disprove this myth instantly.
Now, after going through all of that, let's reflect on the impact of this myth. So we're going to talk about some of the, big impacts that there are, because there are some pretty big issues with believing this myth. So when believing this, it encourages people to think that their limits are caused by unusual brain power rather than lack of learning, practice, or experience. And because of this, people may look for shortcuts to success, which we talked about earlier in this video, but I just really need to hit that home. So, and this is such as like brain supplements, training programs, or mental hacks that claim to unlock hidden potential. As the book explains, this myth is especially appealing to marketers and self-help industries because it sells hope without requiring hard work. When these promises don't work, people often blame themselves instead of questioning the myth itself, which is super bad. This causes mental health problems. This causes depression. This makes people think they are doing something wrong and they could be doing more and their potential is untapped. But on a larger scale, the myth also affects society and science. So the book points out that the brain is an extremely, energy expensive organ, right? So which we know. Even though it only makes about 2 to 3% of our body weight, it uses more than 20% of oxygen we breathe, which is crazy. So from an evolutionary perspective, it makes no sense, literally no sense, for natural selection to maintain an organ where 90% of it serves no function. In addition, clinical evidence shows that even small amounts of brain damage can lead to serious losses in memory. Examples of these losses in memory are language, personality, or consciousness. Phineas Gage is a great example of this. He lost a big chunk of his brain and he changed. And, it wasn't a huge, super drastic change, but there was a change in how he acts. And if most of the brain was unnecessary, like this myth is claiming, then these effects wouldn't be so severe. There wouldn't be huge changes. So it's super important that we challenge this myth. Is it replaces scientific understanding with magical thinking, which we just don't need. Psychologists and neurologists agree that improvement doesn't come from activating unused brain regions, but from strengthening existing neural networks through learning and practicing. This is motor learning. This isn't just some magical drug that we can use. You need to practice every day if you want to get better at something, become more intelligent. it just takes work. The brain isn't, you can't just unlock more of it in order to gain something that's not there. So challenging this myth helps people focus on evidence-based ways to improve their abilities rather than false promises that lead to nothing. It's just them spending money on things they can't use and they won't help. Maybe it might be a little bit of placebo, but that is ultimately all they're going to get. In my life, I've heard this myth, of course, like many of you probably have. Today, I even called my mom just to ask her and see, Mom, do you believe that we only use 10% of the brain? She said, maybe. So she doesn't know for a fact that we do or do not. And so there's a lot of misconception going on in this, because of the films, the shows, all sorts of media online. And I do have a friend personally that does believe this myth. And he chews something called neurogum, and he believes that it's going to open up more percentages of his brain, even though it's just a caffeine gum. And so it's kind of crazy. It's very similar to how people believe, Albert Einstein didn't pass math. He failed math in school, which is just not true. It's just this false thing that people believe, and it kind of gives them like hope, right? That there might be more. Because, of course, people think, oh, the smartest man ever wasn't able to pass math in school. Then that makes them believe, okay, well, then I'll be fine if I don't pass math. I could also be like Albert Einstein, even though it's not true. It's like a false hope. And that's what this myth is. The 10% brain myth is a good example of how easily misinformation can feel true, but when it's repeated often and framed positively. Instead of looking for hidden potential, psychology shows us that growth comes from effort, practice, and evidence-based learning, which is actually more empowering than the myth itself.